Hello, and welcome to the third and final webinar for the Young Pacific Leaders Small Grants Program. My name is Haley Clemson, and I am the Program Development Assistant on the Program Development team at Cultural Vistas, supporting the Young Pacific Leaders Program. For those who have not worked with Cultural Vistas previously, I'll share a little bit about the organization to help give some context. We're a nonprofit international exchange organization and the implementing partners for the Ypl Small Grants program, a program that is funded by the U.S. Department of State and made possible by the U.S. Department of State U.S. mission to New Zealand. The Ypl Small Grants program is a program under the Ypl Initiative, a youth leadership development initiative organized by the U.S. Department of State. In 2018, the Ypl Small Grants program was launched and so far has had 3 iterations, with this being the 4th. The Ypl Small Grants program is an opportunity for Young Pacific Leaders alumni ages 20 to 35 to apply for small grant funding up to $10,000 US to implement innovative projects in the Pacific region related to the 4 core pillars of the Ypl program. These are education, environment and resource management, civic leadership, and economic and social development. To help interested alumni prepare to apply for the Ypl Small Grants program, Cultural Vistas is hosting preparation webinars to provide additional information about the program, as well as to support applicants in the application development process. The first webinar was focused on developing and submitting a grant proposal. And the second webinar focused on putting together a great core project team. Each webinar was recorded and can be found on the website at https:/culturalvistas.org/YPL on the small grants section of that website. The webinar today is the third and final webinar before the application deadline and is focusing on budgeting. This webinar will help teams interested in submitting a proposal to better understand the budgeting process, review the budget template, and help answer questions about what expenses can and cannot be included in project budgets. For those of you joining us live today, at the end of the presentation, we'll have time for questions. Once we get to that section of the webinar, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll go to you for your question. You're also welcome to submit your questions in the chat as we go along, and I'll do my best to answer those questions at the end of the presentation. For those watching the recording, please email your questions directly to yplgrants@culturalvistas.org. The final recording will be uploaded to the YPL website before the end of the week. For those needing additional accessibility resources, including access to the PowerPoint presentations, also please feel free to email yplgrants@culturalvistas.org and let us know. As a reminder, on screen is the outline timeline for the Ypl Small Grants program. This is an important timeline to note and consider as you are preparing your small grants application and project's implementation timeline. Being aware of the small grants implementation timeline is important for your own project's development, as your project's timeline should match that of the program's timeline. The most important date for you to note is on the application timeline is the application deadline. That deadline is next week on the 29th of August, 2022 at 11:59 p.m. New Zealand time. As I shared, today's webinar is focused on preparing a small grant budget and how the budget factors into the project management. Creating a budget can be overwhelming, but it's a critical piece of applying for grant funding. The budget you submit in your application further explains the project idea laid out in the narrative by describing the items that will support the project implementation and help the team achieve the outlined project goals. To help, all budget information can be found on the Ypl Small Grants website, which is shown on screen. You can also find the necessary templates for the budget and more information in your application. An important thing to note is that all applicants must use the provided budget template for your project budget that you will submit at the time of your project application. This template can be found on the website here. If you scroll down to the "How do I come up with a budget" section of the frequently asked questions part of the web page. Once you expand the section, go ahead and click on the underlined text here. This will open an Excel spreadsheet with the budget template. If you have issues accessing the document at any time, you can email us at yplgrants@culturalvistas.org. You can also find the budget template on the application form. If you're on the application, and we can go there now, scroll down to the supporting documents section where you will find the budget template bolded and linked. You can see that here. This will also open up an Excel spreadsheet with the budget template for download. Please also email us at yplgrants@culturalvistas.org if you have any issues accessing the document in either location. Now, let's look more in depth at the template itself. The budget template spreadsheet is modeled after costs generally associated with grant funding. Since the program is funded by the U.S. Department of State, at Cultural Vistas, we abide by all federal regulations outlined in U.S. Department of State grant funding opportunities. This includes both the overall YPL small grant programming, as well as the individual small grants projects themselves. The guidelines this program follows are typical guidelines found with other funder requirements for grant opportunities outside of YPL as well. When applying for grant funding, it is important to always check the budget requirements before applying. This ensures that you provide the correct information and do not request funding for something that cannot be covered. Going back to the items we discussed in webinar number 1, it's very important to make sure you include all requested and required items listed in the grant application. This applies to the budget as well. First, when completing this template, be sure to fill out the top section of the template so we know what project this budget is associated with. Also, make sure that the information you provide across your proposal documents is consistent. Your project title should match the project title you include in your application and all of the additional documents you provide. For the project location, you'll need to outline where the project is being implemented. If it takes place in multiple countries, please list each country. The total amount requested and the total cost share are two different things in the budget template, as you will see. The total amount requested is the amount you are requesting from the YPL Small Grants program. These funds are the total of what you are outlining in the sections at the bottom of this template. This is the total amount of money that is being requested from the YPL Small Grants program and has to specifically go to your project, to the project that you are outlining in your YPL Small Grants project proposal. The total cost share, on the other hand, outlines any funds that you may be receiving from other partners or funders. We received questions from interested applicants about whether your project can have funding from other sources. The answer is yes. For any type of grant funding, it is encouraged that you find opportunities to fund or sustain your project outside of the grant. This shows the sustainability of your project. For the YPL Small Grants program, we do not need to know the specific details of those funds, but do need you to include the total of other amounts of money or cost share that you have received for your project from other funders. You will list the total amount at the top of your budget, but should not outline any specific cost share in the line items in the remaining part of your budget. Again, demonstrating cost share is not required, but highlights the sustainability of a project if it has funding outside of what you are requesting. As a reminder, for the 2022 YPL Small Grants Program, you can request up to $10,000 US. Projects may be conducted in the local currency of the project team or location. However, you need to be sure that when the amount requested is converted, it equals no more than $10,000 US. The total requested amount of funding and the currency being used for the proposed project needs to be consistent across all of your documents and your budget. This means that the currency shown in the line items in your budget should be the same as the currency for the total amount requested. For the project budget, it's incredibly important that you only request the amount of small grants funds you need based on your project proposal and budget research. You can request up to $10,000 US, but do not need to request the full amount of money. If you only need $3,000 to implement your project, for example, only apply for that $3,000. You need to demonstrate that the money you receive for the project is being fully spent towards that project. If selected, you will need to remain on target to spend the amount of funds you requested in your budget for your project. Therefore, it's important to only ask for the amount of funding that is needed. As your project proposal is reviewed, many feasible projects that outline clearly the connection to the requested funding amount and the project work plan and goals will be selected. One way to ensure that you are not requesting more than needed for the project is to request and search for quoted prices on the budgeted items you are proposing. For example, if your project is a workshop in which travel to another specific location is needed, providing a quote for the flights outlines the amount needed for each participating person to travel and ensures that your proposed amount is in line with the amount that you will need for that expense. These quoted items can be detailed in a budget narrative and would be included in the supporting documentation section of your application. If providing this information makes your application stronger and helps clearly outline the project goal, we encourage you to include it. Back to the overall budget template. After the top portion for the background is complete, you'll see the budget is broken up into 4 categories for items described as supplies, travel, personnel, and other. Each is set to guide in thinking through breaking down your project's costs. As previously mentioned, these 4 sections mirror a similar budget structure to the U.S. Department of State grants. This document helps to provide not only a budget template for this program, but also a learning resource that you can build off of for potential future funding opportunities that you may apply for. When compiling your budget, remember that budgets are meant to describe or list out what you will be spending money on for your project. In other words, each line needs to demonstrate the cost of what is going towards your project. You do not have to fill out every line on the template, but try to make your budget as detailed as possible for the purposes of your project. In this section, you'll find a few instructions to remember as you are drafting your budget. Please be sure to read through these instructions in full. You can see the instructions listed here. Now to the item description section. For supplies, what things do you need to budget to make your project work? For example, if your project needs materials such as paper, pens, etc., this is where you would input those costs. Travel. This can be any logistical costs for your project. Some examples might include for a workshop where you're bringing people from different Pacific countries to another location in the Pacific. This would fit in this section of your budget. If your project is in a rural location and you need to bring people from an urban area to the project's location, you include the transportation costs here, etc. Another example is if the project is an exchange, this could be the cost to bring participants for your project from one country to another country. Please note that travel within the Pacific region is the only travel that's fundable. No travel outside of the Pacific, the YPL eligible countries specifically, in the region is allowable for the program. Personnel. A less common expense, generally only if you have to pay a professional for help with the implementation of your project, such as a trainer or facilitator or something like that, with a workshop or a speaker event. This could also be for professional services for items such as multimedia materials, website development, etc. This is not intended, however, for salaries or overhead. Salaries and overhead are not allowable within the funding of the grant. One thing this could be is also an honorarium or speaking fee for a professional assisting you with your project, which is not considered a salary. The honorarium should not exceed $250 per speaker. That's something to keep in mind. And finally, the other category will include any costs that don't fall under the first three categories. Some examples may include a hotel meeting space for a workshop or event, catering if you're hosting a meeting during lunch, or audiovisual requirements. If a budget line item doesn't seem to fall in any of the other three categories of the budget, you can put the item in the other category. Once you decide which category the expense will go in, you'll need to include the item description of the expense. You then enter the unit cost, which again can either be in US dollar or local currency. One thing that we ask, and I know I'm repeating this, but it's very important, is to please be sure to be uniform with this and use the same type of currency consistently for each line and across your project, as well as for your total budget amount. The entire budget should only be in one currency, either all US dollars or all local currency of your choosing. Be sure to include the currency that you will be planning to use for your project at the bottom of the spreadsheet. Next, you'll enter the number of units for each item that you're listing. This will be the number of each item that you need, for example, 27 t-shirts. The total line in gray will be automatically calculated. It's important to remember that all items over $50 must be itemized and described. Do not just include lump sums of the costs without fully describing the anticipated expenses. This is where the information from vendor quotes requested comes in handy to help ensure and outline the accuracy of your estimates in your budget. Finally, as the last point states in the instructions, budgets cannot exceed 10,000 US dollars. Successful funding requests will be at competitive rates and prove how costs directly relate to the project. The spreadsheet will automatically tally your project expenses inputted in the categories above. Before you upload your final budget into the application, be sure to check two things. One, that each line item in the budget is calculated into your budget total. And two, that your final requested amount meets or is below 10,000 US dollars. And don't forget to factor in exchange rates. For those planning to use a local currency, there is not a set exchange rate that we use. If you decide to use your local currency as the currency in your budget, it's important to factor in the currency conversion rates while developing your budget so that you do not exceed the amount allowable for the grant. For exchange rates, Cultural Vistas recommends this converter site for accurate and up-to-date information on the exchange rates. It's called awanda.com. This is the site that we at Cultural Vistas use regularly when trying to inquire about exchange rates. You'll notice that you can adjust by currency here and also by date. This is helpful when trying to estimate the currency conversion amount. Back to the template. As a general practice, it's important to remember that for grant budgets, you should try not to move money between the budgeted categories when you're implementing your project. This further outlines why it's important to estimate the expenses that you foresee as close to accurate as possible in the proposed budget. As the budget template notes, you can reallocate money, but never more than 20% of the category total. This is not encouraged, but if necessary, should always be done with approval from your grant administrator. In this case, for the Ypl Small Grants program, that is Cultural Vistas. For those of you who are new to budget management, it is easiest to try to avoid reallocating funds. However, it can be allowable in minimal amounts as a contingency for extenuating circumstances that may occur. It is important that in this circumstance that the team communicates with the funder, being Cultural Vistas, so that they know about these changes and approve them. As noted on the template, there are certain items that the Ypl Small Grants funds cannot be used for. You can find this in the Remember section of the template here. Ypl Small Grants funds cannot be used to cover international airfare to and from the United States. This is, of course, unless you have a team member from Hawaii or an American affiliated Pacific territory and are conducting an exchange program or have a project in which that team member needs to travel to the project's location in the region. Another thing that the funds cannot cover are staff salaries, overhead, or office rent. If you need a meeting space, funds can go towards a shared workspace, but cannot be used to justify a long-term lease. Something else is large items of durable equipment. So this is an area that we have received a few questions on. Large items of durable equipment cannot usually be funded, but a reasonable request for equipment may be made on a case-by-case basis. As noted in the last webinar, these items cannot be for personal profit. An example is a printer. If you can explain why it is needed and imperative for your project, what you are printing as it pertains to the work that you are completing, then this would be something that would be considered as fundable. If you ever have any questions about what may or may not be covered, you can always email us at yplgrants@culturalvistas.org. Another thing that cannot be covered is excessive representational meals or entertainment. For example, something that would not be fundable is if you requested funds to host a gala dinner. As a note on this as well, all US government funds cannot be used for alcohol. Something else is academic research. This is not an academic grant. This is a project-focused grant looking for specific deliverables and outcomes, and therefore needs to show specific deliverable and outcomes from a project. Partisan political activity can also not be funded. It cannot be used or applied to any government agencies or political activities. Again, if you're not sure whether you can put a specific expense to the grant, given the items that cannot be funded, please email yplgrants@culturalvistas.org and we can clarify for you directly whether your asked expense can be funded or not. That brings us to the end of the budget template review, and now to managing the project and reporting on the money spent by your project team if selected. As noted before, the funding for the small grants program will be dispersed in 3 separate allotments, and project teams will be required to provide a report every month detailing their expenses, along with an update on how the project implementation is going. To remind you, if selected to participate in the Ypl Small Grants project, the project treasurer will receive 60% of the funds for the project after the kickoff workshop in November. The project treasurer will then receive 35% of the funds after submitting the required monthly reports as well as the midterm report. And finally, the project treasurer will receive the last 5% of the project funds after submitting the final report with project results. It's important to think about project management as you're developing your project work plan and application submission, especially thinking through matching the expenses timeline to the funding disbursement timeline of the program. For example, if you know the majority of your project spending will occur upfront, you'll need to think about how you will offset the costs of those items that you cannot cover as you're only just received 60% of the YPL Small Grant funds upfront. At the kickoff workshop, we will work with each of the selected project teams closely to make sure everyone understands the reporting requirements and how to track expenses, as well as what is possible during the budget management period. Following the kickoff workshop, each team will receive 60% of the funding that they requested. Selected teams will only be eligible to receive the funding that was approved in the initial proposal. So once you submit the budget figure for your project in the proposal application, that will be the budget amount for your project through the implementation and end of the program. The transfers of project funds will be sent as a bank transfer to the project treasurer. Cultural Vistas will be covering the cost of the bank transfer fees if they occur. However, if you have a project that will require you to move money between accounts after receiving the funding from us, you may want to consider adding a line in other for bank fees. Each month, project teams will submit a project report and will need to include a budget report along with a narrative. The budget report will demonstrate expenses for the month overall and outline the remaining balance for each line item. This report will need to include copies of all receipts and expenses. These reports will be due at the last day of each month, New Zealand time. More information will be provided about reporting to selected teams during the kickoff workshop. At the midpoint of the implementation period, there will be a midterm report, and that will ask for additional information and an analysis of how the project implementation is going. After the midterm report is received, the project team will receive the next 35% of their funding. In the final month of the implementation period, teams will also submit their final project report. Once the final report is received, teams will then receive the final remaining 5% of funding allocated. As mentioned, teams will be required to provide receipts as part of the budget management and reporting on expenses at each report. This tiered disbursement and allotment ensure that each project is meeting the work plan that was outlined and agreed upon. It's important to note each of these items because as you are developing your project and application, you need to think through how each will be factored into your project management timeline and team responsibilities. Following the final report, the debriefing seminar will be held in June 2023. At this seminar, project leaders will discuss their successes, challenges, learnings, and full project outcomes. As mentioned in previous webinars, programming and expenses include visa fees needed to travel to New Zealand will be covered by Cultural Vistas. For those interested applicants applying for the YPL Small Grants program that are not currently living in the Pacific region, you will be responsible for your travel to a country in the YPL Pacific, and Cultural Vistas will arrange your travel to the debriefing seminar from there. As we conclude the presentation, I want to reiterate what I mentioned earlier. We will be working closely with all selected participants during the kickoff workshop and during the project implementation period to ensure your budget meets and addresses project needs. The proposal budget should be focused on telling your project story through the items you need to make it happen. You need to demonstrate how you plan to achieve the project you describe in your narrative description through the budget as well. The budget is a part of your project story that you are trying to tell and represent in your proposal. Don't forget that. Overall, during the review of applications, the review panel will be looking at whether project budgets align with the proposal, project goals and objectives, as well as the overall project's impact. It's important to keep in mind while constructing your budget that the three things we look for in a project application are feasibility, sustainability, and scalability. Feasibility is, can you complete the project in the given period? Sustainability being, how can the project continue to impact the targeted community past the 6-month funding timeframe? And scalability, how can the project continue to grow in size or impact after the Ypl Small Grants program? Now to questions. I know we have a lot of questions from you, I'm sure. So I'll start with common funding questions that we received across past iterations of the small grants programs from potential applicants, as well as some questions from the Ypl grants inbox. We share the answers to these frequently asked questions so that they may answer questions that you don't know that you have at this time, but that you're glad you now have the answer to. To start, here are some questions that we received from the past 2 webinars that we'd like to share the answers with you for. One question is there any flexibility for the age requirement for the Ypl Small Grants program? And the answer to this is that we recently received approval to extend the age range for core team members in certain circumstances, and we'll be considering applications that include candidates beyond this 35 years of age. Your application will be eligible for review should you choose to proceed in submitting your proposal with team members outside of this age range. Another question that we've received is, what if my team members do not have valid passports? This is a very common question. We will accept applications for team members without valid passports if the application is submitted with the information outlining that the renewal process for a valid passport has begun. As long as we have information outlining that this passport renewal process is in progress and all team members will have valid passports needed to travel to Auckland, New Zealand in November 2022, then your application will still be eligible for review. In your application, please note that this is the case and show proof that this is in progress. Please also note that if passport renewal is necessary for your application, you may include the reimbursement expenses for your passport renewals in your project budget. Additionally to those questions, here are some common budget-related questions that we have received from past iterations of the Small Grants program. One question is, what do I need to consider when making purchases for the grant? Project teams need to have due diligence when estimating costs, meaning that they can demonstrate that expenses are cost-effective, such as not just picking your favorite airline, but comparing the costs between airlines to make a price influence decision. One way to do this is to search multiple possibilities for quotes to give you an idea of the most cost-effective option. Another common question is, can I request funding for an already established project? Or would it be allowed for our proposed project to use Ypl funds to supplement an upcoming project that we are planning to implement during the Ypl grant period? And the answer to this is cost sharing is allowed and highlights the sustainability of the project. If you're proposing a collaboration with an existing project, this project would need to still fulfill the requirements listed under the Ypl Small Grants program guidelines, and would need to be within one of the 4 Ypl pillars. In your project proposal application, in this case, you will need to outline the work already completed on this project and emphasize how the YPL Small Grant 6 months of funding will further the work that you've been doing with this project. Your application and budget must demonstrate and showcase the specific ways that the small grant funds will be applied over the 6 months of the YPL program implementation period. An example of this in past years was an example from last year's recipients for an established reading program where they used the funds to bring the program online and make it further accessible during the times of the COVID-19 pandemic and in reaching more students. Another question commonly asked is, do we need to include other sources of funds if we get outside project sponsors? The answer to this is yes, please include that amount in the sum of funds outlined in the total cost share line of the budget template. However, you do not need to include it in the individual categories for your budget. Another question is, can the funds for the program be used to implement stages of the plan after 6 months? The funds you request should be set out to be fully used for the implementation of the project within the 6-month implementation period. As the implementation occurs, selected teams need to ensure that these funds are used within the funding period for the YPL Small Grant Program. Another question is, do I need to provide documents or price quotations with my budget proposal? The answer to this is no, but if you are trying to demonstrate the need for large equipment, you will need to provide a quote. Again, we recommend that if you are planning to include large equipment in purchases in your budget, to please reach out to Cultural Vistas for confirmation that the item can be funded. No other quotes or invoices are required for the proposal. Should you choose to include any, you may do so. Another question, can I include subscriptions such as a website host domain? Yes, that is a direct cost associated with your project. However, if you do so, please be sure to list by monthly cost as the unit. This can be charged up to the length of the grant, so 6 months worth of that subscription, but cannot cover the subscription costs beyond those 6 months. Can administrative fees be covered? Administrative fees would be considered under salary, office space, and other overhead expenses, and therefore are not fundable. In terms of personnel, an honorarium or speaking fee for a professional assisting your project can be considered and is not considered salary. The honorarium, however, should not exceed that $250 per speaker. Is there a set exchange rate in USD that we should be estimating expenses? Again, there is not a set exchange rate. If you decide to use your local currency, it is important to factor that in when developing your budget to make sure that you do not exceed the amount allowable. And we recommend using a currency converter such as the one that I showed previously in this webinar. Rather than using the treasurer's bank account, would it be okay for us to open a bank account specifically for the project? This is fine to create an account specifically for the project. If you're selected for the program, you'll need to provide that bank information to Cultural Vistas for us to get you your transfers. What about stipends for participants for our workshops? Yes, stipends can be included, or per diems as well, for participants to attend a workshop or similar project. This is normally for participants to have their meals, if not already included in the programming. You can categorize this under travel or other in your budget, and generally can calculate this by day using a researched estimate of the cost of meals in your country or city. Having a set rate for all participants across the board is important to keep it equal. And it's important to include the breakdown of the amount per person in your budget. Another question that we have commonly asked is, may we have a contingency budget included? A general lump sum contingency budget line is not recommended. This is why Cultural Vistas stays in contact with selected teams throughout the implementation period to help course correct if teams find themselves concerned or in need of some assistance with budget management during the implementation period. Throughout the project, it's important to remember that you need to be able to demonstrate that you are spending the money on the requested items throughout the program, which is why we don't recommend this. All right, so now we'll move on to any questions that those in attendance may have. For those who have questions that may come up after the conclusion of the webinar today, or as you're reviewing the recording, please feel free to send your questions to yplgrants@culturalvistas.org, and we'll be sure to address them in the following week or as soon as possible. Don't forget that the application closes next week on the 29th of August at 11:59 p.m. New Zealand time.